The night my mom called me useless, the room didn't erupt or fall silent in a dramatic way. It simply paused, like everyone sensed something had shifted but didn't want to look at it too closely. We were gathered for my uncle's birthday, crowded around a long table, balancing plates on our knees, laughing too loudly the way families do when they avoid real tension. I remember the smell of roasted chicken and the soft clink of glasses just before my name came up. Someone asked what I was doing with my life, the kind of question that sounds harmless until it isn't. I opened my mouth to answer, already nervous, already bracing myself. Before I could speak, my mom laughed and answered for me. She said I was still figuring things out, then added that I'd always been slow, unmotivated, and useless with responsibility. She didn't raise her voice or sound upset. That calm certainty made every word heavier. Her words hung in the air like facts everyone already agreed on. A few people laughed awkwardly, not unkindly, just relieved it wasn't aimed at them. Someone quickly changed the subject. No one defended me. I stared at my plate, my face burning, my appetite gone. This wasn't new. My mom had always found ways to shrink me, especially when others were watching. At home, she called it honesty. In public, she called it humor. She believed embarrassment built character, and I learned early that arguing only made things worse. I was the oldest child, the one who should have known better. When my siblings struggled, explanations followed. When I struggled, lessons followed. That night, surrounded by family chatter and clinking forks, I realized how alone I felt sitting among them. I wasn't angry yet. I felt hollow, like something important had slipped out of reach without anyone noticing. The conversation moved on. Plates were cleared and laughter returned, but I stayed frozen in that moment. When we finally left, my mom talked about traffic and leftovers, about how quiet I'd been all night. She acted as if nothing had happened. I watched streetlights pass by the car window and wondered when I'd started believing her words more than my own. I didn't know it then, but something had cracked inside me. That sentence followed me home, settled into my chest, and changed how I looked at my family forever. That was the night I stopped hoping she'd ever see me differently. It didn't feel dramatic or final in the moment. It felt quiet and unfinished, like a door closing without a sound. I carried that feeling with me, unaware it would shape every step I took after. Nothing was resolved that night. No apologies came. No one asked how I felt. But something had shifted, and I would spend years understanding exactly what broke at that table. It was small to everyone else, but to me, it was the moment everything quietly began to change inside my own life. I didn't wake up one day believing I was useless. That belief didn't arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, like dust you don't notice until everything feels dull. It grew each time my mom looked at me with disappointment instead of patience. Each time her sigh said more than words ever could. From the outside, our house looked calm and organized. Inside, it ran on quiet rules I learned without being taught. Praise was rare and usually reserved for my younger siblings. Mistakes, especially mine, were never forgotten. They were stored away and brought back out whenever proof was needed. My mom believed toughness built character. She said life wouldn't be gentle, so neither should she. When I brought home average grades, she asked why they weren't better. When I worked part-time after school, she said it wasn't enough. If I rested, I was lazy. If I tried something new, she reminded me how often I'd failed before. Over time, I stopped sharing my plans. It felt safer to keep my hopes small and hidden. Dreams became quiet thoughts instead of spoken goals. I learned that excitement invited criticism and confidence invited correction. Silence became my protection. Family gatherings were the hardest. My mom loved telling stories about my childhood, always choosing the ones that made me look careless or slow. Everyone laughed, and I smiled along, pretending it didn't bother me. Inside, I felt myself shrinking, folding inward to take up less space. I watched cousins get praised for things I was criticized for and wondered what I was missing. I worked harder, stayed quieter, and lowered my expectations. Wanting less, hurt less. Or at least that's what I told myself back then. By the time I moved out, I carried her voice everywhere. It followed me to job interviews, relationships, and quiet nights alone. When things went wrong, I wasn't surprised. When they went right, I waited for them to fall apart. I told myself this was just who I was. Still, part of me wanted distance. Not just space, but freedom from constant judgment. I took a modest job, paid my bills, and kept my life simple. My mom called often, usually to remind me of what I wasn't doing. She compared me to others, asked why I wasn't more ambitious, more settled, more impressive. That dinner wasn't an accident. It was the result of years of her believing she had the right to define me. What she didn't know was that something inside me had started to shift. I wasn't ready to prove her wrong. I was just tired of proving her right. Without realizing it, I had begun stepping toward a life she couldn't control. After that dinner, something changed in how I moved through my days. Nothing dramatic. I didn't confront my mom or cut her off. I just stopped expecting warmth where it had never really existed before. I answered her calls with careful distance, already learning silence could feel safer than hope. My life was simple then. I worked full time, saved what I could, and came home to a small apartment that felt quiet in a good way. No one criticized how I spent my evenings. No one watched for mistakes. For once, my thoughts felt like they belonged to me. Still, my mom had a way of reminding me she was never far away. She noticed the change quickly and asked why I came around less. She said I was distant, ungrateful, and cold. When I said work was exhausting, she laughed and said, I didn't know real exhaustion yet. Every conversation felt like a test I couldn't pass. If I explained myself, I was sensitive. If I stayed quiet, I had nothing to say. Her words always landed sharp and familiar, reminding me that silence and defense both failed me the same way every single time we spoke again. Family gatherings grew shorter and heavier. My siblings talked about promotions, relationships, and future plans. My mom listened closely, then looked at me waiting for proof I was behind. Sometimes she sighed and said she worried. Other times she joked I was finding myself. The words always landed the same. What hurt most wasn't her criticism. It was how normal it felt to everyone else. No one questioned her tone or corrected her. I wondered if they saw me the same way she did. That thought followed me home and stayed long after the drive ended and the door closed. Despite everything, I kept building my life quietly. I paid bills on time, showed up to work daily, and learned to rely on myself without asking permission or praise. I didn't feel successful, but I felt steady, and that steadiness slowly became mine alone without witnesses or approval anymore inside. That steadiness made my mom uneasy. I could hear it in her questions, her warnings, and advice I never asked for. She reminded me how easily things could fail, how fast I could fall behind again. Her concern felt less like care and more like fear losing control over me. I didn't realize then that the distance was preparing me for something larger. I was learning to stand without leaning on her opinions. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was filling with strength, patience, and quiet resolve. When change finally arrived, it would test whether that distance could hold. At the time, I only knew things felt different inside me. Not better, not worse. Just shifting slowly like ground settling after years of pressure. I kept moving forward, unaware how much this quiet separation would matter later, when everything else finally changed without warning at all for good reason. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was folding laundry. I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number, and part of me was tired of unexpected conversations. When I finally picked up, the voice on the other end asked if I was sitting down. That was how I knew something was wrong. It was my aunt, my mom's older sister. Her voice sounded thin and worn, older than I remembered it. She told me my grandfather had passed away early that morning. The words landed softly but carried weight. I hadn't seen him in years, not because we weren't close, but because life had slowly pulled us apart. After my grandmother died, he lived alone. Visits became phone calls, then memories. I thanked her for calling and hung up. I stood there holding a single sock, staring at the wall like it might explain how I was supposed to feel. Sadness came first, slow and heavy, then guilt followed close behind. I tried to remember the last time we'd spoken. I wondered if he thought I'd forgotten him. The apartment felt suddenly too quiet. I called my mom later that evening. She answered right away, her voice already tight with emotion. She talked about funeral plans, about family expectations, about how hard this was on her. I listened, nodding even though she couldn't see me. When I said I was sorry, she told me I should have visited more. The words hit harder than I expected. Even now, even here, blame found me. The days leading up to the funeral felt heavy and rushed.
Messages filled the family group chat. Decisions were made quickly, often without my input. I stayed on the edge of everything, informed but not included. Part of me expected that. Another part felt relieved not to be pulled deeper into it all. At the service, I stood near the back.
My mom cried loudly, drawing comfort from everyone around her. People hugged her, spoke softly to her, told her how strong she was. I watched from a distance, unsure where I belonged. When others spoke about my grandfather, they talked about his kindness, his patience, his quiet way of helping without asking for anything in return. My throat tightened. He had never made me feel useless, not once.
After the service, people gathered in small circles, sharing stories and polite smiles. I was about to leave when my aunt touched my arm. She said my grandfather had asked about me often. She said he was proud of me, though she didn't know why exactly. That sentence stayed with me longer than the rest of the day combined. As I drove home, grief mixed with confusion.
Something about that conversation didn't sit right. It felt unfinished, like a door left slightly open. I had no idea then that this loss would soon change everything I thought I understood about my family, my past, and my future. After the funeral, I couldn't stop thinking about what my aunt had said, that my grandfather asked about me, that he was proud.
Those words didn't fit the version of myself I'd been carrying for years. They didn't match what my mom said or how she described me to others. At first, I told myself my aunt was only trying to comfort me in a hard moment. But the thought kept returning, quieter each time, until it felt less like kindness and more like truth waiting for me to notice it.
On its own, without anyone else saying it aloud. When I was younger, my grandfather never lectured me or talked down to me. He listened instead. When I spoke, he didn't rush me or correct my words halfway through. He asked simple questions and waited for real answers, even when they came slowly. I remembered how he used to slip me a few dollars when no one was looking, not as a reward, but as trust. He never laughed at my mistakes or compared me to anyone else in the room. Those moments stayed with me longer than I realized back then, quietly shaping how safe I felt there. We didn't talk often in the years before he passed, but when we did, his questions felt different. He asked about my work without judgment, about whether I was managing okay on my own. He wanted to know if I was eating well, if I was tired, if I felt overwhelmed. I used to think those calls were small and forgettable. Sitting alone after the funeral, I realized they were check-ins, not out of habit, but care meant to remind me I wasn't invisible to him, even when I felt that way everywhere else in my life at that time. A week after the funeral, my aunt called again, and her voice sounded careful this time. She asked if I would come with her to my grandfather's house to help sort through things. I hesitated because that house felt like a door I wasn't ready to open yet. Still, I agreed. The place smelled the same as always: old books, wood polish, and warmth. He kept everything: notes, receipts, birthday cards. He wasn't the kind of person who threw parts of life away easily. That drawer proved it when she opened it slowly, and then stopped breathing for a moment. I saw the letters with my name written across the front and couldn't bring myself to read them. Just knowing they existed made my chest tighten. My aunt said my grandfather worried about me more than I knew. She said he didn't agree with how my mom spoke to me, but he didn't know how to step in without making things worse. That night, alone in my apartment, I considered something new. Maybe my life had been watched with care, not disappointment. The thought comforted me, then unsettled me just as deeply, because it meant someone chose differently than her. I waited 2 full days before opening the letters. They sat on my kitchen table like they were aware of me, stacked neatly, impossible to ignore. I told myself I needed time to grieve, to settle down, to breathe.
The truth was simpler. I was afraid of what they might say. Words have a way of changing things, and I wasn't sure I was ready for my life to feel different yet. When I finally opened the first envelope, my hands shook more than I expected. His handwriting was careful and steady, every letter shaped with intention. He wrote my name at the top, like it mattered, like it belonged there.
The letter wasn't long. He said he hoped I was doing well and that he didn't always know how to say what he felt out loud. He wrote that he admired my independence, that he noticed how I kept going without asking for much, and that kind of strength didn't go unnoticed. I read it once, then again, then a third time. No one had ever described me that way before, not even close.
The words felt unfamiliar, like they were meant for someone else, but they carried a warmth I couldn't deny. I felt my chest tighten, not with pain, but with something close to relief. The next letter felt heavier. He wrote about family, about how patterns repeat when no one stops them.
He said he worried my mom confused criticism with care, and that her fear of failure made her cruel in ways she didn't fully see. He didn't excuse her behavior, but he explained it. He admitted he stayed quiet too often, hoping time would soften things. He wrote that silence can protect peace, but it can also protect harm. He said he might have been wrong. By the time I reached the last letter, my eyes burned. In it, he apologized, not for leaving, but for not speaking up sooner. He said he wanted me to know my worth wasn't something anyone else got to decide. He wrote that I had always been enough, even on the days I felt invisible, even when I doubted myself most. I folded the letter carefully and leaned back in my chair. The apartment felt different, like the walls had shifted slightly. Grief washed over me, but it wasn't empty or sharp. It carried something solid beneath it. Truth, the kind that settles instead of cuts. Later that evening, my mom called. She asked if I'd been to the house yet. I said yes. She asked what I'd found. I said nothing important. There was a pause, longer than normal. She said we'd need to talk soon, that there were things to settle. Her voice sounded controlled, tight. After we hung up, I stared at the letters again. I didn't know what was coming next, but I knew something had already changed. For the first time in my life, someone had put into words what I'd never been able to defend. Whatever my grandfather had planned, it wasn't meant to stay buried. It was meant to be read, and soon it would be known. My mom asked to meet for coffee the following weekend. She didn't explain why. She just said it was important and that we needed to talk face to face. That alone was enough to make my stomach tighten. She had never framed things as requests before. She told people what was happening. This time, though, her message felt careful, almost polite, and that difference stayed with me. I arrived early and chose a table near the window, more out of habit than comfort. When she walked in, she didn't smile right away. She scanned the room before spotting me like she was measuring the space and who might be listening. She hugged me quickly, stiff and brief, then sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She stirred her coffee even though she hadn't added anything to it. She started by asking how I was holding up after the funeral. The question felt practiced, like she'd tried it out beforehand. I answered honestly but briefly. She nodded, as if she'd expected that exact response, then shifted in her seat. That was when she said there were logistics we needed to discuss, estate matters, paperwork, family responsibilities. Her voice stayed calm, but something underneath it felt tight. I listened while she explained that my grandfather hadn't left things simple. She said there were decisions to be made and that it would be easier if we were all on the same page.
When I asked what that meant, she smiled without warmth and said she was just thinking ahead, thinking of the family. That word lingered between us. Family. It had always meant obligation to her, control, expectations. To me, it had started to mean distance. She talked about how hard she'd worked to keep everyone together over the years, how much stress she carried, how disappointing it was when people didn't step up the way she expected. She never said my name, but I felt it woven into every sentence, familiar and heavy. Then she did something she had never done before. She asked me what I wanted, not what I planned to do, not what I should do, what I wanted. The question caught me off guard. It felt unfamiliar, almost unsafe.
I told her I hadn't thought about it yet. That part was true. She nodded too quickly and said that was fine. She said we'd talk again soon, that some things would become clearer with time. When she stood to leave, she squeezed my shoulder and told me she was proud of how I was handling things. The words sounded practiced, like they belonged to someone else.
As I watched her walk out, I didn't feel relief. I felt uneasy. Something in her tone had changed, not softened. It was focused, controlled, like she was preparing for something she hadn't told me yet. I finished my coffee alone, replaying every sentence in my head. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that meeting hadn't been about comfort or closure. It had been about positioning.
And whatever was coming next would force truths into the open that none of us were ready to face. The letter from the lawyer arrived 2 weeks later in a plain white envelope with no return address that meant anything to me. I almost tossed it aside with the rest of the mail, already thinking about dinner, until I noticed my name typed neatly on the front. My chest tightened before I even opened it, like my body understood something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. The office was small and quiet, the kind of place where voices stayed low and time felt slowed down on purpose. The lawyer greeted me politely and spoke in an even tone, like this meeting was just another part of his day. He explained that my grandfather had updated his will less than a year before he passed. He talked about accounts, paperwork, and instructions.
I tried to listen carefully, but my thoughts felt thick and slow, like they were moving through water. Then he said the number $100,000. For a second, I was sure I'd misheard him. I asked him to repeat it, embarrassed by how small my voice sounded. He did, without hesitation or emotion.
He explained that my grandfather had left the money directly to me, separate from the rest of the estate. No conditions, no shared decisions, no one else involved. Just me. I stared at the edge of the desk, unable to speak. My ears rang softly. All I could hear was my mom's voice from that dinner table, steady and confident, useless, slow, unmotivated.
The contrast between those words and this moment made my chest ache in a way I couldn't explain. The lawyer slid a document across the table. Attached was a short handwritten note from my grandfather. He wrote that the money wasn't meant to fix my life. It was meant to support it. He said he trusted me to use it wisely. In my own time, in my own way.
I read the note twice, my throat tightening with every sentence. When I walked out of the office, the world felt too bright and too loud, like someone had turned the volume up without warning. I sat in my car for a long time with my hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. I didn't feel rich. I felt exposed, like something deeply personal had been brought into the open without my permission. My phone buzzed before I even reached home. A message from my mom. She asked if I'd heard anything yet. I stared at the screen, then turned it face down. I wasn't ready to answer questions I hadn't figured out myself. That night, I reread my grandfather's letter slowly. I thought about every moment I doubted myself, every time I'd stayed quiet to keep the peace. The money didn't erase those memories, but it changed what they meant. It proved something I'd never been able to prove on my own. I fell asleep knowing everything was about to shift, not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented. Someone had believed in me enough to make a choice that couldn't be argued away, and when my mom found out, there would be no way to laugh it off. The truth was coming, and it wouldn't be gentle. I didn't tell my mom right away. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I needed time to understand what the money meant to me before letting it become something between us. I needed space to think without her voice filling the room. That space didn't last long. She called 3 days in a row, each voicemail shorter and more urgent than the last. When I finally agreed to meet, she insisted on coming to my apartment instead of choosing a cafe or restaurant. That alone felt intentional. She stood in my doorway when she arrived, her eyes scanning the room like she was looking for signs of change. New furniture, new confidence, proof that something had already shifted. I invited her in and offered coffee. She waved it away and got straight to the point. She asked if I'd met with the lawyer. I said yes. Her shoulders stiffened immediately, like she'd been bracing for that answer. She asked what I'd been told. I told her the truth, calmly and clearly. I didn't raise my voice or soften my words. I said the amount. I said who it was for. Then I stopped talking. Her face went still. For a second, she looked almost confused. Then she laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. She said there must have been a mistake. She said my grandfather wouldn't have done something like that without discussing it with her first. When I didn't respond, she asked why I hadn't told her sooner. I said I was still processing it. That answer seemed to frustrate her more than anger would have. She began speaking quickly, pacing slightly, explaining how money complicates families. She talked about transparency, responsibility, and planning. She said she had assumed the inheritance would be shared, managed properly, handled by people who knew what they were doing. That was when the memory of the dinner table came back to me. The way she'd spoken about me like I wasn't there. I didn't interrupt her right away. I waited until she paused, until the room filled with a thick, uncomfortable silence. Then I asked her why she thought my grandfather wouldn't trust me with it. She froze like the question caught her off guard. She said she worried, that she'd always worried. I asked if that worry was why she called me useless in front of everyone. The words felt heavier out loud. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She said I was taking things out of context, that she never meant it that way, that she was just trying to motivate me. I nodded slowly. I told her I understood. I told her I wasn't angry, and that was true. What she didn't understand was that her words no longer defined me. The money hadn't changed who I was, it had changed who she could no longer control. And as she stood there with nothing left to argue, I realized the power had shifted quietly. For the first time, she had nothing left to say. After that conversation, my mom didn't call for a while. At first, I checked my phone out of habit, expecting her name to appear like it always had. Days passed. Then weeks. The silence felt strange, like waiting for a storm that never came.
I kept expecting an apology, an explanation, something to tie the moment together neatly. Nothing arrived. When she did reach out again, her tone was different. Not warmer, just careful. She asked how work was going, commented on the weather, mentioned something she'd seen on the news. She didn't bring up the money. She didn't mention our conversation.
I answered politely, keeping my responses short. We were learning a new rhythm, one built on distance instead of control. I thought I would feel triumphant after everything settled. I imagined relief would feel loud or obvious. It didn't. What I felt was steady, calm, like I'd finally set something heavy down without realizing how long I'd been carrying it. I didn't need her approval anymore. I didn't need her to admit she was wrong. I had something stronger than that. I had clarity. The money stayed untouched. I left it where it was, letting it sit while I figured out what I actually wanted. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about choice. For the first time, I could make decisions without hearing her voice in my head telling me what would go wrong.
Family gatherings changed in subtle ways. My mom watched her words more closely. She didn't joke at my expense or make quiet comments meant to sting. She didn't offer advice unless I asked. Other relatives noticed the shift but didn't comment on it. They treated me differently too, like something unspoken had been revealed. One afternoon, my aunt called and asked how I was really doing.
Not the polite version, the honest one. I told her the truth. That I felt lighter. She paused, then said my grandfather would have liked that. She said he always believed peace was worth more than pride. I believe that too, even more now. I never confronted my mom again about the past. I didn't need to. Her silence told me more than any apology could have. It told me she understood even if she would never say it out loud. It told me she saw the boundary and chose not to cross it. Late one evening, I reread my grandfather's letters one last time and placed them carefully in a drawer. They had done their job. They reminded me who I was when no one else did. I didn't need to keep rereading them to believe the truth anymore. The story didn't end with revenge or celebration. It ended with something quieter and stronger. Freedom. And that, more than the money, was the inheritance that changed my life. Once the noise settled, I finally had space to hear myself think. Not my mom's voice, not the echoes of old comments that used to fill every quiet moment, just my own thoughts, steady and unchallenged. That was new. I didn't rush to fill the silence with distractions or explanations. I let it sit with me, uncomfortable at first, then slowly familiar, like learning how to breathe differently. I began noticing small changes in myself, things I would have missed before. I stood a little straighter at work without thinking about it. I spoke up in meetings without rehearsing every sentence in my head first. When problems came up, I handled them without immediately assuming failure was waiting nearby. None of this happened all at once. It felt more like waking up after a long sleep, adjusting slowly to the light. The money stayed in the background where it belonged. I didn't announce it or let it become part of my identity. I didn't use it to impress anyone or prove a point. It wasn't proof anymore, it was possibility. I met with a financial advisor, not because I felt lost or overwhelmed, but because I wanted to be intentional. That choice felt different from fear. It felt like respect for myself. I thought about my grandfather often during that time, about how he watched quietly while I doubted myself loudly for years. I realized he never tried to rescue me or push me in a certain direction. He trusted me to grow at my own pace. That trust mattered more than the amount he left behind. It felt like something solid I could stand on. My relationship with my mom remained distant but calm. We spoke occasionally, keeping conversations light. She asked fewer questions. When she offered opinions, I listened without absorbing them automatically. I weighed them, decided what mattered, and let the rest go. That shift alone felt like freedom I hadn't known before. One afternoon, while washing dishes, I caught myself smiling for no reason. It surprised me. I stood there for a moment, hands in soapy water, trying to understand why I felt so at ease. Then it clicked. I wasn't waiting for her approval anymore. I wasn't waiting for anyone's. I learned that worth doesn't feel loud. It doesn't demand attention or constant validation. It feels calm. It feels like standing on solid ground without needing to explain why you deserve to be there. The past didn't disappear. The memories were still there, but they no longer controlled how I saw myself. They became chapters instead of definitions. For years, I thought proving my value meant achieving something big enough that no one could deny it. I was wrong. Real value didn't come from being seen. It came from seeing myself clearly. That realization didn't make life perfect. Things were still complicated, but they became honest. And honesty, I learned, was a kind of peace I'd never known before. People assume money changes everything, that it flips a switch and suddenly life feels easier, brighter, louder. For me, it didn't work that way. The money didn't change who I was at my core. It quietly revealed who I had already become after years of doubt and quiet effort alone. I paid off a few lingering debts, not because I was drowning, but because I wanted a clean slate. I fixed things I had postponed, replaced what was worn down, and invested in my health with steady, practical choices that made daily life calmer, simpler, and easier to manage long term. Nothing I did was flashy or dramatic. I didn't quit my job or disappear. I kept my routine because I liked it, because it was familiar and mine, and because stability finally felt like something I deserved without guilt, fear, or constant self-doubt hanging over every ordinary day anymore inside. The biggest change was knowing I had options. I wasn't trapped by my schedule or paycheck anymore. That quiet knowledge followed me into work each morning and made even difficult days feel lighter to carry without panic, pressure, or the old fear of failure waiting around every corner quietly, watching. My mom eventually learned I hadn't shared the money or handed control to anyone. She didn't comment or ask questions. Her silence spoke clearly, marking a boundary she recognized even if she didn't agree with it, and quietly changed how we moved around each other from then on forward afterward. Other relatives reacted in their own ways. Some were curious, some awkward, some suddenly warmer than before. I noticed it all and let it pass, knowing their reactions were not my responsibility to manage, explain, justify, or soften for their comfort anymore at all. Inside myself now calmly and freely, I kept thinking about my grandfather's words, especially the line about support. Not fixing. He was right. My life wasn't broken. It simply needed room to grow without constant judgment hanging overhead, shaping choices, shrinking confidence, or deciding worth for me anymore at this stage of my life, now peacefully. What surprised me most was how little resentment I carried. I expected anger to linger, but clarity replaced it instead. Seeing my mom as flawed freed me without excusing what she did or pretending the past never hurt, shaped, or mattered deeply to me then or now anymore at all. I stopped replaying old conversations in my head. I stopped planning better responses or perfect endings. I didn't need closure from her. I had already given that to myself through honesty, acceptance, patience, and choosing peace over endless internal arguments that never changed anything meaningful before in my life again. The money became one part of my story, not the headline. The real change happened quietly, and how I treated myself when no one was watching or judging my choices, my pace, my worth, or my right to exist confidently, steadily, and without apology anymore, at all inside my life. When I think back to that dinner table now, the memory feels distant. Not erased, just smaller. It doesn't rise up the way it used to or tighten my chest without warning. It no longer defines me. Instead, it reminds me how far I've come since the night I thought one sentence had decided who I was. My mom is still part of my life, but she no longer narrates it. We speak when necessary and keep conversations light. I don't share the parts of myself she hasn't earned the right to know. That boundary didn't come from anger, it came from understanding, and it protects us both in ways I didn't expect. Sometimes I wonder if she ever thinks about what she said that night. If she remembers how casually she dismissed me in front of everyone. I'll probably never know. And surprisingly, I'm okay with that. I don't need her understanding or regret to validate what I lived through. My experience doesn't depend on her memory. What I carry with me now is quieter than I imagined it would be. Confidence that doesn't need applause, peace that doesn't ask permission, a sense of self that doesn't bend every time someone else is disappointed. It feels steady, like something rooted instead of borrowed. I keep my grandfather's letters in a drawer, not because I need to reread them anymore, but because they remind me what it feels like to be seen without conditions. He gave me that gift long before the money ever arrived, long before anyone else realized what he already knew. The inheritance changed my circumstances. His belief changed my life. That difference matters more to me than anything else that came from his passing. I used to think justice had to be loud, that people needed to be confronted, proven wrong, embarrassed the way I had been embarrassed. I believed silence meant weakness and distance meant loss. I was wrong about that too. The most powerful response I ever gave was living well without explaining myself. If someone had told me years ago that peace would come from letting go instead of fighting back, I wouldn't have believed them. I thought strength meant endurance, holding on, taking everything without breaking. I've learned it means choice, choosing where to stay, choosing where to step back, choosing myself without apology. I didn't win anything. I didn't defeat anyone. There was no final argument or dramatic ending. I simply stepped into a life that fit me better than the one I'd been shrinking to survive. And when I look ahead now, I don't feel fear waiting for me. I feel grounded. I feel ready. Not because someone finally approved of me, but because I finally did. That's what I took with me in the end. Not the money, not the silence, but the certainty that I was never useless. I was just waiting for the truth to reach me.